panel. All right. So this is the panel where we get to bring it all together to sort of reflect back on Dr. Kuhl's speech last night about human brain development and the degree to which language acquisition forms the actual architecture of the brain, to think about Professor Gruski's keynote this morning, very clearly outlining how we can essentially build a public good of opportunities around early learning and early education. And then also think about how to build community power, as we've just talked about in this last panel that immediately preceded us. And welcome, Kevin McCarty. We're glad. So this is essentially the panel where we get to the conversation about how to operationalize all of that. How do we move from the science and the economics to thinking about how it happens politically? So I think this is a very meaty conversation, and I know that this is one that gets anticipated greatly with every year, and I think this is a fabulous panel to actually dive into the topic. So thank you all for being with us. And the first question is really about this topic of collaboration and coalition building. So as many of you know, the water cooler is built on this idea that if you can bring together a diverse set of stakeholders from early childhood, from the K-12 world, from business, from labor, parent groups, community groups, health, if we can sing with one voice, that we can provide enough of a powerful movement to actually drive very serious investments. So the question that I wanted to start with is if you can describe how you see coalition building and collaboration working in the political sphere, and if there's any examples that you can draw on where you've seen it working effectively, if you can hold those up. And we can just start here and go down the line.
Sure. Well, my name is Heins. I'm a teacher in Pittsburgh, California, and currently on leave to serve as president of CTA. And we, in fact, work with a lot of coalitions, including the K-12 water cooler, with our labor partners around many issues. One around, of course, the resources that are necessary to implement a lot of these early childhood programs and a lot of the priorities that we all share. And where we have very limited resources now, but we don't necessarily have to accept that. So as a coalition, we have to come around common values, common interests, but then also take the next step to action. And so one, of course, is expanding the resources. One would be keeping the resources we have by renewing the Prop 30 taxes that are set to expire that actually plugged a hole for us and didn't really fix it. We need to reprioritize the resources we have by short-circuiting the school-to-prison pipeline that actually incentivizes children to fail in schools because we then pay 10 times as much and somebody makes a profit from incarcerating them later on. We need to just be clear about what our priorities are and work together in coalition and not be afraid to talk to each other even when we think we disagree. Because when we're separate and we don't talk, then our opponents win.
So the reason that early education got on the national radar, I think, has to do with the fact that from the outset there was an effort to build a big tent coalition. Now, we're the usual suspects, right? We're kids advocates, we're parents, we're teachers, we're engaged in this. But when you get district attorneys and police chiefs and head of church groups and generals and admirals all coming together and saying this is, and although I hate to mention Duke's basketball coach who wrote a Washington Post op-ed about how he'd never have a basketball team if it wasn't for preschool or something like that. You get that kind of a big tent coalition that takes you beyond early education, beyond just kids in the narrow sense, but to the broader sense. The other thing I would say is how dispiriting it is that any coalition includes and excludes, and you wind up with these unhappy tensions, right, between something called childcare and something called early education, as if there really was a difference. We're all about educating kids, right? As between parent support programs of various kinds, and particularly as between the K-12 system and the early education system. I mean, if we're really going to make a difference in kids' lives, it really does mean putting those groups together and putting our narrow concerns aside and really asking what I think of as the golden rule question. Is what's being offered good enough so that you'd want it for a child that you love? That's the criteria that ought to bring us together.
I concur. I just want to note that, first of all, it's great to be here at the water cooler. I sat in the chairs for many years, so coming up here is a different perspective. But I think a big piece of this is not to just thank Molly and Kim for what you're doing and the Ambassador Project, but just more of this, getting a big tent of people coming up here to the policymakers at the Capitol and showing that it matters. I will say that I'm encouraged that this is a bipartisan issue across the nation. We have red states and blue states focusing on preschool for all. And last year I had a big preschool bill, and I was super excited that not only got all the Democrats to support it, but on the Assembly we had 18 Republicans that voted for the measure. So it does show that it's not a partisan issue, making sure that we focus, what you just said, that it really addresses a lot of issues that we're trying to focus on policymakers in California, certainly closing the achievement gap. But you get our district attorneys, our police chiefs, our sheriffs talking about how this has an impact on crime, and we're trying to reduce our prison population and the school to prison pipeline, so we focus on that. Certainly with the big focus on inequality and equity issues, that early education is a key element to that. So I think the larger tent you can focus on not just people in the room, but how we can really address some of the societal issues of the day increases the odds of making this a successful endeavor.
Well, this is a natural for the California Legislative Women's Caucus. It's an area that I served in the legislature, started in 1998. It was the one area where we could get both the Republican and Democratic women to agree. And it was our strong push and has been for the last decade and a half. Now is our time, though, I think, and I think in part for just some of the reasons that are being discussed here today. We know because of brain mapping how critical 0 to 3 is in the brain development of a child. Those of us who've parented and been closely engaged in the raising of our children have observed this. I mean, little ones are sponges. They absorb things very, very quickly, or they don't, based upon the kind of quality contact they get with their care providers. It's historically been moms and women. Now we have a scientific demonstration of that I think is unchallenged. I mean, we still argue about climate change, but I don't think anybody is arguing about the importance of 0 to 3 in brain development. So that's one thing. The second thing from the perspective of the Women's Caucus is the economics. More and more women are in the workforce today than ever before, and they're in the workforce because their families need their income. Over 50% of women now are in the workforce. Of that, 70% are either the sole breadwinner, the primary breadwinner, or their income is necessary to meet the necessities of life. And when you put those two characteristics together, you recognize with some urgency the importance of this issue. So that has been of critical concern. And we know just by, I mean, you recited this isn't rocket science, that if children get started earlier, their outcomes in life are better. We spend less money on incarcerating people in prison. We're now up to $65,000 a year to incarcerate someone in prison. What do we spend to educate a child? We know that there is a greater likelihood that children will go on for higher education. They're less likely to get in trouble. Girls are less likely to get pregnant. I mean, it's almost a no-brainer. But the Women's Caucus has sort of taken the lead on this, I won't say by default, but it's one area where we all can come together and we can all articulate that commitment. And while we're doing well on pre-K, and I want to give credit to the Assembly member here and to CTA, I also want to indicate that this issue it should not be siloed. This is a continuum. And we should start at the earliest possible ages to make sure that we are addressing the needs of children from prenatal care all the way through until hopefully we can get them out the door at some point in their lives. So let me just tell you what we did last year as a Women's Caucus. Over the past 2 years, we've helped restore more than $500 million into these programs that was lost during the Great Recession. We've been reinstating childcare and preschool now for more than 45,000 children. And this last year, we were able to help secure an additional $265 million to fund our state's childcare and preschool programs. But that has got to be just the beginning. So as we go on, I realize I've probably gone over my time, but I think it's really important that we come together. And frankly, I look around this room, and thank you for all the men who are here, but what is this? About 90% of this room is women. And we have to keep that voice going. And you know, we can be pretty tough and pretty feisty. And this is one area where we really need to continue that commitment. And Molly, thank you for being so dedicated in making this happen. So thank you.
So I wanted to pick up on one of the themes that Senator Jackson just articulated, and that's the issue of outcomes. So I think one of the very core tenets that is often sort of described as early learning's reason for being is school readiness to succeed in the K-12 system. So for Eric, I wanted to ask, I think one of the ways that we build better and stronger partnerships is to have open lines of communication. So the question that comes to mind is, how can ECE be a better partner to the K-12 system? And then also, how do you feel like the K-12 system can be a better partner with ECE?
Well, you know, first of all, we represent actually preschool teachers as well in many of our districts. So early childhood is actually part of our fiber. And my first foray into CTA policy wonkishness was actually in the Early Childhood Education Policy Committee on our state council, which is our big policy-making body. At that time, we only had two main priorities. One was moving up the date for kindergarten so that we didn't have 4-year-olds coming into kindergarten, and the second one was mandatory kindergarten. We accomplished one of them, and at least to some respect. But I think we had to broaden the conversation. And for us in K-12, we have to have kind of broaden what we think about preschool and think about how we fund preschools and how we talk to preschool teachers. Because, you know, when we talk to most of our preschool teachers, the ones in my district that we represent, you know, they're not fully certificated teachers. They have an early childhood credential. They're frequently paid a lot less. So we need to make sure that when we ask more of our early childhood educators, that we actually pay them for that and not put them in the same same category, asking more and then continuing to pay them the same rate. But we need to, like I said, have the conversations with each other even when we think we disagree. It's very important, you know, when we look at one thing, I think the last history of the last 15 years under No Child Left Behind around outcomes and around academic standards and how we've continued to push those academic standards down and down and down. And the kindergarten I taught in the beginning of my career, which was part of a multi-age primary class, looked entirely different. You know, it was 90% all stations and mixed groupings and all of that, and 10% maybe whole class teaching, as opposed to Old Child Left Behind, where it was 90% all class teaching and 10% so-called differentiation. And I think what we're doing to early children and early childhood education in school is tantamount to child abuse, because it's developmentally inappropriate, and I believe it needs to change, and I think we have a common interest in that. We're now beginning to rediscover the importance of play. I think if we had continued, I'm a big believer in play, for myself as well. I think that, if we had continued on the trajectory we were on under No Child Left Behind and some of these so-called outcome-focused programs and curriculums, we would have gone to prenatal literacy. And, you know, instead of talking about healthcare and prenatal, we would have started drawing letters on women's bellies and then handed them a pencil on the way out and asked them to fill in a bubble. You know, because that was as silly, and that sounds silly, but that was the trajectory we were hitting on. And we all pushed for whole day kindergarten and more preschool classes. But what we did in those classes wasn't helping the children. We made them sit down at desks and fill out worksheets. And what we're learning now is that as they get older, of course, they don't have the fine motor skills. They don't learn how to interact with each other, how to share, how to do all those basic things. You remember the book, Everything I Learned in Kindergarten. Well, we don't learn those things anymore. And for many families, they're not learning them at home either. And so that puts them at a real disadvantage as they continue to move forward. But conversations like this, and also conversations internally that we're having within CTA, we just need to broaden our definition of what it means and what it means to be a whole child. And how do we address the needs of whole childs and the families that they're in California.
Thank you. Assemblymember McCarty, I'm just going to say Kevin, if that's okay. And what is so exciting, I think, about what Eric was just describing is how much more it is in the air, how much more teachers are aware and sort of celebrating what the early years bring to the table in K-12. And we've seen that translating in the last couple of years, as Senator Jackson was describing, into budget investments. How do you see the potential to build on the momentum of the last couple of years? How do you see the potential to breathe life into the preschool promise? And can you describe a little bit about your new legislative plans with AB 2660?
Sure. Well, I guess it's interesting to kind of look back. So 10 years ago, we had the big Preschool for All measure on the ballot in 2006. Prop 82 didn't quite go so well, but I think I started the important dialogue about early learning. And certainly I realized too, as Senator Jackson said, it's not just for 4-year-olds, it starts at birth. I have 2 little girls in 1st grade, and I know they had 3 fabulous years of preschool, and their reading level is just tremendous. And you know, but for that great preschool education, it wouldn't be there. So I see it, and to me, it's a crime that not all kids in California have it. So again, going back 10 years, we started this campaign, I think, in California. The recession was in the middle, but we have seen some progress. Certainly, as you mentioned, we had the transitional kindergarten piece, not just changing the date, but providing over 100,000 publicly funded pre-K slots in California. And the research just came out recently that shows it's making a tremendous impact in preparing kids to enter kindergarten ready to learn. But you know, there is work to be done. We saw a huge drop in childcare and preschool access during the recession. In the last 2 years, we've been able to increase slots just in state preschool by 20,000, about 10,000 per year. So we're almost where we were at the peak in like 2009, 2010. But that being said, there are still 35,000 low-income 4-year-olds today that don't have access to either Head Start, our state preschool program, or transitional kindergarten. And so that is mine, I think, our speaker, our new speaker, as everyone knows, he knows this stuff. He can tell you what the regional market rate is and real preschool stuff. So and child care. So he really gets it. And so I think that's half the battle, is that he really understands. And so I think that there's a big focus to really deal with the unmet need in California. And some people lament that you know, we have a governor who's, you know, I think it's been said over and over, who's not 100% all there on the science and the importance of investing in this. But let's face it, we have had some progress. I mean, we've put, in large part because of the great teamwork with the legislature and the Women's Caucus and the Assembly and the Senate to make sure this is a priority, because it's not, you know, it's a multi, you know, pieces of government making this work. And so we made sure it's a priority. So in my view, I think that we can try to focus as much as we can in the next few years with this current administration. And frankly, I think it's important I think that people running for governor in 2 years, this is going to be on their list of things to do. You already see the candidates out there, they're already talking about it. If it's not, I expect all of you will be knocking on their doors, making sure it's on their platform. But I think the next couple years focus on how we can have a system in California that really invests in our youngest learners to make sure that no kids are left behind when they enter kindergarten. And so I think that that's what I'm working on in the budget process and through my legislation. I just left a hearing this morning that the budget subcommittee we chair, Superintendent Torlixon and I were talking about this, and the bill that I'm working on this year is really sets in motion a plan for pre-K for all in California, and sets a roadmap to how to make that happen.
That's great. Thank you. Senator Jackson, I think if we can pick up on that theme of dealing with the unmet need as it exists for not just preschoolers, but infants and toddlers, I really think very candidly that we all owe the Women's Caucus a debt of gratitude. You guys have been out in front in an incredible way.
Thank you.
And so what I would love to hear is a little bit about what the plans are for this upcoming year, how you're thinking about the budget process, and also a little bit of perhaps reflections on what worked in last year's budget negotiations, not just with the governor, but with your fellow legislators, because this is a panel of the sort of choir for sure. These are people who are on the side of little kids, and it's not that I think other legislators are not, but it's a lower ranked priority for other legislators. So
Well,
how are you thinking about the lessons learned from last year's
Well, using the choir as an analogy, some people want to sing soprano and some want to sing alto, and so we, like everyone else, there's been a little bit of a difference of opinion as to how to achieve our goals. There are so many different aspects to this. There's quality, there's access, there's affordability. We have an issue of the number of slots that are available, the rates that we're paying our child care providers are inadequate. We've lost over 30% of all of our child care providers in the last 9 years. They have left the profession because they are not paid a wage that can sustain them or their families. So this is something that we are trying to address as well this year. We're still hundreds of thousands of children short in terms of available slots for these children. And one of the issues too is, a lot of women, particularly low-income women, do not work traditional hours. They are working non-traditional hours, and there's no childcare available from midnight to 7 a.m. And so these are really challenges that we have. So this year, I won't say that we rolled the dice, but we said, last year we asked for $600 million, we got 265. What the heck, let's go for more. So our budget request this year, we're still arguing over whether it's 800 million or $1 billion. But whatever it is, we know it's not enough. And the challenge is going to be to make this a priority for the governor. And look, we know the governor has been a challenge. I was able to elicit a commitment that he'll keep talking to us about this issue. We need to give him the data, because this is a fellow that says, how can we do more with less? And that's a fair question. We do know, though, when we have the resources for child care, it is a system that works. Child care and early education. It is a system that works. We want to elevate it. We want to make it a quality system. We want our providers to all have additional education. We know that in many instances, child care providers who work at child care centers are paid a higher rate than those who have family care, child care, but that isn't even enough. We need them to get professional development, but we don't pay them to do it. There are lots of things here. So what we're hoping to do this year is to raise the discussion and to be loud and feisty. Well-behaved women rarely make history, right? So, and we have a few good men who are with us. One of them sitting here, two others sitting here, and we want to bring them into the discussion, because the fact is today that we're seeing more and more young men participating in parenting their children. And I have many of them on my staff. And if Joey's sick and mom's working, dad's the one that's got to leave work. And we're getting it, as a society. Younger men, because the responsibilities are being shared more, although we have a long way to go there as well. And the Women's Caucus is working on that as well. But what we need to do is recognize that we need to make the investment. We need to continue the dialogue. Education doesn't start at 4 or 5 years old. Education starts right from the beginning, and I remember the notion we were just talking about, maybe drawing on a pregnant woman's belly. I don't know about you, but I learned that Mozart was really good for, in utero, and I used to play a lot of Mozart for my daughter before she was even with us. So I think that we recognize the importance of providing opportunity for all our children. So accessibility, quality, affordability, and giving these providers who are nurturing and providing that earliest care for our kids the kind of income that they deserve in order to encourage more people to get into the profession.
I wanted to ask one follow-up question on the sort of budget conversation, and that is that there seems to be some recognition and salience, I think of a fairly broadly supported type for preschool. But it's not clear that the rest of our legislative community is quite yet there on infants and toddlers. How do you see the way forward in bringing along our legislative community, our K-12 leaders, our broad cross-section of influentials to equally prioritize infants and toddlers as we do preschoolers?
A couple simple answers: elect more women. And of course, a few good men who are with us. But they're not few. I'll tell you part of it, and then Kevin, I apologize, is we need to educate people on how important 0 to 3 is, or 0 to 4 is. Because again, if you haven't participated actively in rearing a child from the beginning of their lives, you don't recognize. You can just watch a child emerge, the light bulbs go on, the warmth and love and affection that every child needs at the earliest possible stages. And that information, if you think that's too granola and crunchy, take a look at the science. Take a look at all the brain mapping. It shows you the brain opening up to that kind of warmth and love and nurturing. So if you are someone who requires, scientific analyses, we've got that. And if you're just a parent or a grandparent, which I am now, and I have to say the best job in the world, I know those of you out there, you realize that you are watching life evolving and emerging and enjoy. And I mean, that's the connection that we have as human beings, and it's one that we have to remind our colleagues is frankly the reason that we're all here.
I'd like to add to that. I think that when we can have a conversation around science and around facts and around statistics, and all of that is all well and good, and there are a lot of organizations that do that. But ultimately, these are decisions that are made based on values and based on the heart and not necessarily in the head. And so the one thing that no one else has, but what you all have, is your stories. And those are the most powerful things. So what you need to do is bring out and share your stories with these so-called experts and with our leaders, and not be afraid to come and bring the stories to them and share with them the struggles that they're having and the successes and how the research that they're hearing about, all this great research, which I'm really excited about, but how that actually plays out in real life. And here's a child who's actually benefited from that. And what it means when we have children having children. and all those things, the stories they can never take from us. And they're ultimately the most powerful, because these really are value conversations.
I would focus on a couple things. One is I used to be a preschool advocate, so I'm thinking about that job and also a legislator. As far as preschool and childcare, in the budget, I've learned too, it's a lot of times simple math. In preschool, as many of you know, the state preschool program is funded under Prop 98. So when there's more money in there, they've got to spend it somewhere in 98, and so you're able to expand state preschool access. Whereas the infant and toddler program and childcare, you're fighting in the whole general fund pie. Up until the last couple of years, there wasn't much to really go around, and so you're focusing on healthcare, money for social services, welfare, maximum family grant issues, higher education, Medi-Cal reimbursement rates, up until yesterday, developmental disability issues, SSI, and so there's a whole piece. And so, going back to the advocate lens is I would I would focus on telling your stories, but bring policymakers, lawmakers, bring them to your locations. If you're at a center or a school, or show them your story and ask them. Because if you go up to a policymaker, legislator, and you say, do you support ECE, early care and education, pre-K, whatever you want to call it? Yeah, I'm for that. But do they love it? Is it a top 5 issue? Because they're all going to say they're for it, but how do you make it one of those top 5 issues? And go there and really emphasize how it really is and meets again, what I said in my first comments, how it meets the objectives that we're trying to tackle in California. Addressing income inequality, poverty, criminal justice issues, education, how all these issues can blend together with one, not simple solution, but one important investment in our youngsters in California.
So let me join the choir and say, I'm not sure what I'm going to be singing, tenor or bass, whatever, and say that the stories are crucial, and showing people things is crucial. There's a lot of data of all sorts, right? There's the economic return on investment stuff. There's the science stuff. There's the long-term evaluation stuff. It's important, but I don't think people get it until they actually go to a really good early education center. I remember when I was giving a talk, it was actually to the Marin County educators. There's a wonderful county superintendent there, and there were one of the local school board members said, but how are we going to bring the preschool teachers up to the level of the K-3 teachers? And I said, you've got to go to a pre-K class to see what fantastic teaching is like, what early education is like. I mean, it really is the model for what we should be doing generally with kids. It's the K-12 system that needs to learn from early education. It's all that. The farther up you go the ladder, as you know, the more the prestige, the worse the teaching. And we college professors, we're at the bottom of the, we get the prestige and not the teaching. And that whole notion of if you're in high school, if you're in preschool, you teach kids. If you're in elementary school, you teach kids. If you're in high school, you teach math or science or something else. It's a big difference in terms of what it is that's going on. So the stories need to be situated, I think, in context for people to get. It's not just a feel-good story. It's really a larger issue that needs to be addressed. The other thing, if I accomplish one thing here, it's going to be to get people to stop saying, ready to learn. You go to kindergarten, ready to learn. I mean, read Alison Gopnik, the scientist in the crib, will tell you, right, at 45 minutes after being born, kids they're learning in the womb, but they're actually out there looking and learning what's going on. So it's giving them a better shot. But I think if you put it that way, you really frame everything in terms of school values and not the whole child values. So that, it seems to me, part of that education that you're talking about is giving people a sense of just how important those earliest years are, how you get the word gaps opening up at 18 months and doubling at 24 months. And the effect that that's going to have. You have all that nurture, all the love and affection, and the impact that has on brain development. How this is not just babysitting. This is, in a lot of ways, the most important education we have. And I want to say one other thing about this. The conversation, does pre-K work, right? It's going on forever. There's more research on showing that pre-K works than on any other social policy that I know. Better research than on the relationship between smoking and cancer. Which is all correlational. This is demonstrably effective. But it's the wrong question. That's the other point I want to say. We don't ask, does kindergarten work? Or God help us, does senior year in high school work? Because we'd be afraid of the answer to that question. Right? If it weren't for high school football, there would never be a senior year in high school. People are either bored or what have you then. But I digress. The question that you ask about K-12, the question you ask about kindergarten isn't, does it work? The question is, how do you make it better? Mm-hmm. And that needs to be how we shift the focus of the conversation. The does it work is over. It works. We got to make it work better, and that's where the quality part of the conversation is so crucial.
Thank you. So, David, you actually occupy a unique perch on this panel, and that is that you are a citizen of California, but you are also a keen observer of national politics and comparative early learning systems. So I'm wondering, what can you share about some of the comparison points in New York City and some of your work with other states, and what can California learn from those other geographies?
I just, by the way, want to stick in one, I'll get there in a second, one story sort of related to the parent PowerPoint that Mary made earlier. The most effective kids lobbyists that I know, people will argue about this, I have no doubt, are in Chicago. They've been at this as a group since the 1970s. They cut across the entire array of issues. They fight out their priorities behind closed doors. They come out, here's what they're going to do. Illinois was the first state to have 10% set aside for infants and toddlers programs as part of its early education system. Every year, 50 or 60,000 people are bused to the state capitol, Springfield, to make the pitch for early education. And I remember one parent from the south side of Chicago saying to her legislator, so how can you get more money and better programs for our kids? And the lawmaker said, you know, ma'am, I'd love to do that. I just don't have the authority, the influence to do it. And she turns to him and says, so how do we elect somebody who actually has that kind of authority influence? That's the parent power that Mary was talking about. So I'm these days wearing three hats. I'm a professor at Berkeley. I'm also a senior scholar at this new Learning Policy Institute that many of you have heard of. That's headed by Linda Darling Hammond. And I'm now a contributing writer to the New York Times and writing about children and youth issues. And one of the great things about that role is everybody returns your phone calls right away. They have New York Times, there it is. And by the way, the kids' stories, and they're mostly solution stories, wind up being invariably top 10 most emailed, top 10 most tweeted stories. And that, I think, is because people are tired of the fighting. They want to know things that work, you know, in a whole array of kids-related issues. So I recently wrote about what New York City is doing, and I think New York City is a really interesting, I bet there are a few other New Yorkers, ex-New Yorkers out there in the audience. There you go. Oh, thank you. Thank you. But I want to talk about New York City because California says, oh, other places, you know, we're the whatever, 7th richest country in the world, leave us alone, we don't want to know about that stuff. So here's what New York City did. It increased the number of full day pre-kindergarten slots by 50,000 in a period of 2 years. There are now 70,000 children in full-day pre-kindergarten in New York City. To give you a sense of what that number means, there are more full-day pre-kindergarten kids in New York City than in any state except Georgia. There are more kids in full-day pre-kindergarten in New York than there are students in Boston or Cleveland or Detroit or San Francisco or Sacramento. So it's a big lift, a big, fast lift. And the numbers are amazing. And what they had to do to find the good community partners to work with, because 2/3 of these children are going to schools that are run by community partners. And as those of you who read the piece will know, I begin by saying, you know, you don't normally find borscht, you know, in early childhood programs, but there they were, right? You know, there it was. You don't find kids learning about Greek culture, but there in another preschool, that was what was going on in the Hellenic Center. So it's a quite amazing system. 1,500 new teachers had to be found, 300 new coaches, 500 new private providers, 200 new social workers to work with these kids. So the numbers are big, but it's the quality that's really important. We now know, we've used the word quality so many times without it really having content. But it really does have content. We know what's needed for early education. So what are they doing? For starters, they looked at the research and they looked at the exemplar programs. You know, New Jersey's Abbott program, those of you who know it, is a fabulously good program. You know, EduCare is wonderful, but it serves a small number of folks. Abbott is serving thousands and 25,000 poor kids. And they follow those kids up through 5th grade. Great results in a whole array of things. Boston, fabulous program. So they look to see what the data is. They decide early on, this is going to be a program for all kids. And why? Because all kids benefit from pre-K. We know that poor kids and vulnerable kids benefit the most. What we don't know is that middle-class kids come to kindergarten as far behind their kids of professionals as poor kids come to pre-kindergarten behind their middle-class peers. It's also the right thing to do. Imagine we're going to have kindergarten. I mean, just think, get rid of the pre or the early in these conversations and think, okay, we're now going to have kindergarten only for poor kids. Imagine, or we're going to have half-day kindergarten for some kids. I mean, imagine what the first grade, what have you, the riots would look like. The only difference between pre-K and kindergarten is that you've got a bigger opportunity to learn. The younger the kids are, the more the opportunity looks like. It's a universal program. It's a full-day program, but the percentage of kids in pre-K in New York is the same as the percentage of kids in kindergarten. So they really have reached everybody in that system. They've gone out to the homeless shelters. They've gone into communities where people are just suspicious of schools, and the advocates have made the case for why kids learn, and it's worked. 16,
David,
yeah.
Can I just break in and ask, what is the will building story there? How did this come about, and what is their magic recipe, and how can we replicate it?
Oh, well, always the question. So we'll take quality, right? Size of classes, curriculum, coaching, all that stuff, which is the key as the outcome given. It starts with people like the people in this room who educated Bill de Blasio as a city councilman beforehand. Where did Barack Obama get his commitment to early education? Because those Chicago community groups I was mentioning to him, and a far-sighted man who was, just loved early education in the 1980s, took him to one side and said, this is what matters. So you start there. It's a big tent coalition. It includes all those groups that we described. It's got a school chancellor, Carmen Farina, who, when she was a district superintendent, took money out of her K-12 program to make sure there was universal early education. So she was committed to this right away. And it's not in New York. There's always somebody looking over your shoulder, and that somebody is called the New York Post. If you haven't seen the New York Post, think about remember the National Enquirer? This is the New York Post, and you would really think there are horror stories. There really aren't. That's very important. They have administered this in a brilliant way. So it's a very complicated system to manage. And they've pulled together the funds. You don't have TK and pre-K and child care. You've got a universal pre-K program. They're not done. They've got to figure out supporting 0 to 4 as well as they are here. But that combination of things, now they've got a track record. And now every parent with a young child is a constituent for this program. So that's the New York story. There's no way to make that happen without strong political leadership. There's no way to get strong political leadership without the kind of impact that a group like this can have on leaders to educate them before the fact.
So one of the very intriguing models that Illinois has pioneered, and this is a loaded analogy given the governor's current proposal, but they have an early learning block grant. I'm going to bracket the early learning block grant conversation because we'll have a little bit more of that conversation in the last panel. But what's intriguing about the Illinois model is that they have a mandatory growth model, which says for every preschool dollar, 10% first needed to be set aside for infants and toddlers. And then they grew that, I think, to 20% in Illinois. How would you all gauge the political will to tether those types of concepts, to have an automatic formula that says if one grows, the other must as well?
That's a good question for the lawmaker.
I don't think that's a bad concept. I think the trouble, and you're going to talk about this later today, with the proposal we hear for the governor is it's the same amount of money, and we've lost so many slots. And this morning we talked about how the infant and toddler slots was like 20,000 down just a few years ago. So how do you reshuffle the same amount of a pot of money and figure that out? I think many of us in this room would rather we have, like you say, a TK program for all 4-year-olds at all income levels, because you don't want to, segregate have economic segregation in our education system, and also have the same increase in early education and infant and toddler and child care. But I'm not sure if the math's on the table on our current budget situation and our current administration. Again, I just think, we need to, like you said, in New York and Chicago, find leaders, put the pressure on them to make sure this is a #1 issue that we're going to focus on. And it's not my idea. I like to say that our new speaker, Anthony Rendon, Rendon. Some people call different words there. I think his grandparents say Rendon, but we call him up here Rendon in Sacramento, is that, he had a great suggestion. Says, next year when we have all these gubernatorial candidates coming around here, why don't we have a debate or a forum on early education and talk about the brain science?
I like it.
And I think that's where the huge opportunity is. We can do as much as we can in this current environment with the budget, the current administration, but really set the stage for the next decade in California for investing in early learners from 0 to 5.
Yeah, I think part of it is education. You all in this room are committed to this issue, but I don't think the general public has been as aware of the need for early care and education. Child care, babysitting. It's had all of these really negative connotations, and I'm thinking of the phrase that when the people lead, the leaders will follow. And I think in great measure, that is a problem because there are a finite number of dollars, and we know that nobody likes to share. Everybody feels that their issue is the most important and that they don't have enough money for it. And then you have pressure, no additional funding, no more taxes, and find a better way to do something. And again, politics is really, a lot of it is perception. People need to believe that there is an urgency to this, that we are going to, and I think we can demonstrate that, save enormous amounts of money if we start early and educate children from all walks of life so that we reduce crime, we reduce gangs, we get better results, we have a workforce that can do the work that is required in this state. There is a monetary part to it, there's a quality of life part to it, there's a values part to it. I think it's really incumbent upon people like you and hopefully the Women's Caucus. As I said, we've been committed to child care issues for the last 15, 16 years that I'm aware of. Nothing happens quickly. Last year I got my equal pay bill passed. I call it my 35-year. I call it my 35-year overnight success. And I think that's what we have to keep doing here. In fact, I'll tell you one story and then I'll stop. 15 years ago when I was first elected in the Assembly, the one thing, we were in the middle of budget negotiations. That's when we needed a 2/3 vote. We were on the floor at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the women got a little bit feisty. And we said, our Republican colleagues are in there and they are caucusing. They don't want to put any money in for child care. So we stood outside the door and had the women join us, the Republican women, and we did a mantra: child care, child care, child care. And then one of them came out and said, we're Republicans, we don't respond well to that kind of pressure. But the point is we have to keep saying that. Early care and education, it's critically important. We need the resources for it. It saves money at the end of the day. It helps parents who need to work go to work. It gives a quality educational experience to all of our children, and it's good for the economy, it's good for our society, it's good for our future, and keep banging that drum, and hopefully it won't take 35 years to make it an overnight success, but we need to continue doing that.
Can I just add one thing? One thing we haven't really addressed, and frequently when we think about all these child care solutions and all of this early child education, we're thinking really of our urban centers. And we're really, a large part of our state is rural, and we have many rural communities which don't have the resources and don't have the density, or don't have they're too migrant, or there come different resources from the U.S. Forestry Service or other places like that. And any solution we have for the children really has to also address the needs of our rural communities and our more migrant communities in the Central Valley as well. And we just want to be sure not to forget that and just think about Los Angeles and the Bay Area.
I think that's absolutely right. Thank you.
I just want to add a little footnote. I get nervous when we talk about all the miracles that early education is going to do. Because it says, well, if you're done, right? You're done at age 5, then off you go. You can't think about early education in isolation from what's going on in K-12 and beyond.
Yeah.
There's got to be an alliance, not just a political alliance, but an educational alliance between those. If you want to know why preschool programs sometimes don't work, right? It's because there's no follow-up, there's no connection between what's going on. So I'm hoping that the tent gets bigger, so it's a 0 to 20 tent, because that's really what we need to educate our kids.
Thank you. And on that note, I want to ask everyone to join us in thanking the panel. Thank you all for your comments.